Welcome to this week's mini lesson for the online animal behavior course. In the last lesson, we discussed animal cooperation, how it might have evolved, and how its ubiquity shows that working together is likely fundamental to most living organisms. But in today's mini lesson, we're going to examine a proposed mechanism for stabilizing cooperation over time. That mechanism is inequity aversion. Now, imagine you and your best friend were just hired on at the same company after you graduated. You both were successful in undergrad and are both hired at the same position in this new company. When you go out to celebrate with your friend that night, your friend accidentally lets it slip that they will be making $20,000 more than you per year. Now let that sink in. How does that make you feel? Or how about this scenario? Say you and your group turn in a project. Everyone in the group worked really hard and did their part. But when you get the grades back, your group members all received A's and you received a C. How does that make you feel? Frustrated, potentially angry, maybe even demotivated, perhaps even less likely to help next time? Well, this reaction that you just felt, this sense of this isn't fair, is at the heart of something that scientists call inequity aversion. And interestingly, it's not just humans who feel this way. Animals likely do too. Even though most models of cooperation assume equal outcomes, in real life, this is rarely true. When two hyenas hunt together, one may get more of the prey than the other. When chimpanzees groom each other, one might invest more time and effort than the other. When in a romantic relationship, one partner may carry a lot of the responsibilities and give the most in time, effort, money, etc., while the other is more aloof and apathetic. This raises an important question. Within these cooperative partnerships, what should the partner who is being disadvantaged do? The answer to this question is a complex one because it really depends on the situation. However, what we do know is that these situations happen all the time in nature, and animals that cooperate need to be able to identify these situations and respond appropriately. Inequity aversion is the process in which an individual responds negatively to receiving less than a partner. Some of these negative responses include refusing to cooperate, becoming aggressive, or maybe just withdrawing and stopping their participation altogether. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about inequity aversion, though, is that it has direct ties to cooperation. The important part of inequity aversion is that it may have been critical for the evolution of cooperation. By comparing one's own efforts to the payoffs of others, individuals can determine a partner's relative value relative to their outcomes. And they can then choose to only participate in cooperation that pays relatively fairly. Whether that's over the short term or whether that's over the long term, this process can really help stabilize cooperation by discouraging freeloaders and cheaters and promoting equitable partnerships. Now, decades of research on animal behavior has shown that several primate species, including humans, as well as other animals like corvids and dogs, all respond negatively when they receive less than a social partner for equal work. Now, a range of experimental paradigms have been used, all trying to understand this process of inequity aversion better. But let's look at the classic paradigm that was originally used to investigate this in animals. In this setup, two animals are placed side by side so they can observe each other working. They both must complete the same task. However, their rewards are different. One subject receives more and one subject receives less. Researchers then observe and record how the partner who receives less responds or behaves. So let's look at a famous video of this in action. All right, so you can see they're going to hand, this one individual hands the experimenter a rock and then receives a cucumber and then happily eats it. Then their partner has to do the exact same task. They've got to reach through, hand the rock to the experimenter, and then that monkey gets a grape. So now we're going to go back to the original subject who does the exact same task, but this time receives a cucumber, and instead of eating it, tosses it back at the experimenter, rejecting the food, right? And starts to get a little bit of angry there towards the experimenter. Then the other monkey is going to once again do the task again, and this time she's going to receive a grape. And then the partner or the subject is going to then do it one more time. She's going to test the rock first and then hands it back to the experimenter. This time receives a cucumber and once again, rejection. And then we see a little bit of anger there at the end. So that is sort of the classic paradigm. This is from a very famous video from a TED Talk by Dr. Brosnan de Waal, based on research by Dr. Sarah Brosnan with capuchin monkeys. So we can see clearly that one individual was not too happy that she was getting paid less than her partner. But to truly show that an animal has inequity aversion requires a lot of really important control conditions. So let's say we ran this study with a bunch of monkeys and found the following results. We see that when the subject and the partner receives grapes, they almost never reject the food reward. However, when the subject receives a cucumber and their partner receives a grape, the subject drastically increases the number of times that it rejects that cucumber. Just like the video, they're reacting negatively to receiving less than their partner. But is this data alone enough to prove inequity aversion? Take a second and think about that. What might also explain the behavior that we see in this graph? All right, now that you've thought about it, this is a bit of a tricky question. We still don't actually know whether the monkeys are comparing their efforts and their rewards to that of their partners. For that, we need more controls. The first alternative explanation for this behavior is that the monkey is simply seeing the highly preferred food item, in this case a grape, and then because they can't get it, they get frustrated or upset. This actually has nothing to do with tracking a partner's efforts or rewards. Instead, they're just disappointed in the situation. So how might we test for that? Well, we can run two more control conditions. First, we can show the monkeys a high value food item, and then instead of giving one individual a grape and one individual a cucumber, they both instead get a low value cucumber. And then we're going to go ahead, so we'll go ahead and call this one the cucumber condition, right? So we'll add that in there. And so go ahead and predict, before I show you the results, predict what you would expect if an animal is showing inequity aversion, what you would expect to happen in this cucumber condition. Okay, so because inequity aversion is supposed to be a social phenomenon, we would expect them to reject the reward less in this condition than in the original unequal condition, because both partners are receiving the same reward. So if the two partners are comparing to what they got with each other, then we would expect them to not reject the reward because nobody's getting paid more. They're just there. The grapes, the high value food item, are just visible, but no one is actually getting them. Now, of course, the monkeys still reject the reward some because they're monkeys and they do want grapes, but it's less than when their partner gets a grape and they get a cucumber. But how do we know that they're actually reacting to the partner? What if they're just reacting to the high value food item being placed into the enclosure next to them? Well, we can run another control to control for that. So in this next condition, we remove the partner entirely, and instead we just place a high value food item next to the subject while they do the work. And so how would you expect the monkeys to respond then? All right, so once again, if they are comparing their payouts for their efforts to their partners, we would expect rejections to occur less frequently in this condition. If you can show these results in an animal, then you have pretty good evidence that they are responding to getting less than their partner for equal effort. And so there are, of course, many other controls to really hone in on this process. But I wanted to show you sort of these four conditions to really highlight how building in good controls into an experiment, you can start to really uncover how and why animals are behaving the way that they are. So let's go ahead and dive into a practice question. So let's say that you wanted to test fiddler crabs on the classic inequity paradigm to see if they are averse to unequal outcomes. You run a very similar task. You pair up two crabs and you show them sort of run them through these three different conditions, right? The high condition where both partner and subject get high value food items. You get the unequal condition where you have low high, and then you have the condition where you show them a high value food, but both partners get a low value food item. And so these are the results. So go ahead and try to interpret what this graph means. Awesome. So this graph tells us that it's not about comparing between the subject and the partner. And instead, they're actually just disappointed that they didn't receive the visible high value food item. So how do we know this? Well, when their partner received the same low value food item, they were still rejecting the food. And so it was not about the inequity, but it was instead about the presence of high value food that elicited the response. And so this really just sort of highlights that not all results are as straightforward as sometimes we go about talking about in this class. And sometimes they can actually kind of show that a process maybe is not present, or at least not in this context. Do animals show inequity aversion or a process that we're testing? right, so while inequity aversion is a fascinating phenomenon, there are still some really important debates and limitations to consider, some of which we just talked about based on our control conditions. So first, are animals really responding to fairness, or are they simply frustrated because they didn't get a better reward? And this is really still an open question that has been debated and is still debated even to this day. Second, not all species show inequity aversion. Some animals seem completely unbothered by unequal rewards, which suggests that it might not be a universal trait. Another one is that context plays a big role. So inequity responses can depend on social relationships, while whether the partner is a kin or maybe like an ally. Sometimes animals will tolerate inequity if sort of the social bond dictates that they should, right? So it's not all universal, right? Just because a species shows it in one context does not mean they will show it in another. So overall, the central debate, though, is inequity aversion truly a stepping stone towards a sense of fairness, like we see in humans? Or is it simply just a self-serving strategy? On one hand, some researchers argue that when animals reject unequal treatment, they are expressing a primitive form of what we would call fairness. Basically, they're valuing equality even at a cost to themselves. Now, this interpretation suggests that inequity aversion might be one of the evolutionary building blocks of human cooperation and maybe even human morality. Now, on the other hand, others argue that it may just be about self-interest. The animal isn't really concerned about fairness in the abstract sense. It just doesn't want to keep playing a game where it's constantly being the loser. From this perspective, inequity aversion is less about fairness and more about protecting oneself from exploitation. Now, this tension between fairness as a moral sentiment and fairness as a strategic tool to cooperate with partners and choose better partners lies sort of at the heart of the ongoing research in this field. And so why does inequity aversion matter? Well, there are two main reasons. First, it gives us insights into the evolution of cooperation. Studying animals helps us to see how fairness may have been a critical ingredient for keeping cooperative relationships stable over time. Lastly, there are strong connections to human social behavior. Our sensitivity to fairness in classrooms, in families, in friendships, in romantic relationships, and even in the workplace echoes what we see in animals. Ultimately, by understanding how animals respond to unfairness, we can begin to reveal the evolutionary foundations of fairness and cooperation in our own species.